studying for the lab exam, then you turn it in then on Wednesday of next week at the lab exam, okay? So that's how it's going to go. All right, so we're almost down to the end here, and so we don't have a whole lot more. Just want to cover a little bit more on plants, a little bit of physiology. Usually when I fall behind, this gets thrown out, but I have, for some reason, through the nervous system and muscles, I seem to have sped up or something. But so I'm putting this in here. The last lecture was mostly on structure, because we did that with animals, and so we did this with plants as well. And so that's mostly just memorization, okay? It's not a whole lot of thinking about it. There's a little bit of thinking if you put your mind into it. There are certain mental shortcuts that you can take to understand, for example, where would you find xylem in any vascular bundle? It's always toward the center of the stem or the root or whatever it happens to be. But here now it's going to be a little bit of physiology. Okay, how do things move about in the plant? Okay, that's what we're wanting to talk about. All right, so get on into it. Okay, so we've already gone over that the way things are moving in plants from one place to another is through vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is very, very important. Bryophytes don't have vascular tissue. Moss plants, liverworts, and so forth. And that is one of the things that restricts their size. They can, since things are moving by simple diffusion throughout from one cell to the next cell, that's very inefficient, and therefore these plants are restricted to very small stature. But once we have tracheophytes, all tracheophytes have both xylem and phloem, then size could increase. Okay, and in fact, in angiosperms, both in gymnosperms and angiosperms, we have some of the biggest plants that exist. So in the xylem, that water and minerals primarily happen to be transported, and usually and of course the direction is generally from roots up to the leaf into the shoot. Okay. And the phloem is where organic materials, there's water there too, because these organic materials have to be transported in an aqueous medium. However, this is a little bit more viscous, the material in the phloem, and we usually call it sap. Okay, it's sticky because it usually has a lot of sucrose in it. Sucrose is the way in which carbohydrate is being moved in plants from one place to another, okay? But also amino acids, hormones, and other things are also being moved into phloem. As I went over last time, the transport cells in xylem are dead at maturity, okay? And so they're just only the empty shells of the, just only the cell walls. That's all that's left of them. However, in the phloem, the cells are alive, okay? All right, and there's a reason for that. First of all, look at the water transport. How is it? Now, if we look at some statistics on some trees, and this is data from a maple tree, that adult maple tree, about 15 meters tall, so get that in your head, it's about 40 feet, okay, about 40 feet high. Furthermore, a maple tree, a lot of leaves, 177,000 leaves, believe it or not. For this study, someone actually, probably undergraduate students, probably went out there and the professor made them count leaves or something, and also measured the surface area of the leaves. All right, and so this is a big surface area, 575 square feet. Okay, all those leaves on one individual maple tree. So this represents a big area for water loss. Okay, in fact, this is one of the biggest problems with trees or with plants is water loss. Animals lose water too. Okay, all terrestrial animals nevertheless have evolved some sort of system to minimize that loss. Animals, we have dead skin, scales, other things loaded with keratin that impede water loss, but it doesn't absolutely prevent water loss. Plant leaves have waxy cuticle, but they also have another problem here in that they have to have carbon dioxide, okay? So they have to have the stomata open in order to get the carbon dioxide, and that's also where they lose water. But as we'll see here too, it's necessary for evaporation at the leaf in order for them to move water through the system anyway. And therefore, they have to lose water just to move minerals from the roots up to the leaves, all right? It's required. All right, but still, measuring in this tree, it's 220 liters per hour being evaporated of water from these leaves. Okay, divide that by 4, you get close to how many gallons that is, and that's more than what your bathtub probably holds, okay, per hour. Okay, a lot of water loss. And furthermore, if you miss this particular study, measuring in the xylem itself, the rate at which the water is moving up the stem, okay, through the xylem is 15 meters per hour. So that's a pretty big amount of water moving through the system, and therefore plants in general, they lose far more water by evaporation than an animal of comparable gram weight, okay, of comparable body size. Some of this has to be done, okay, because we have to have minerals from the soil that make it up to the leaves and other growing parts of the plant. However, for bulk movement of water like this, plants do not have any sort of pumps, okay? Unlike animals, we still circulate our blood using, hearts. I mentioned at the cellular tissue level, there are no pumps for water. Water is manipulated by manipulating solute concentration, because we have pumps, molecular pumps for solutes. But here in plants, especially when you think about the xylem, this is where the water is moving, those cells are dead, okay? So there's no biological activity that can be responsible for moving that water through the xylem. Okay, so the mechanism by which this water is being moved in the xylem was discovered actually quite some time ago, back in the 1800s by a guy named Strasburger. And he, one thing, used various types of poisons on the plants that he was studying, and poisoned certain parts, selectively poisoned certain parts of the plant, okay, and measured the water. So one thing in the xylem and phloem, that living cells were not responsible for the movement, because if he poisoned that area, of course we already know the xylem is dead anyway, that did not affect the rate at which water was moving through the xylem. They killed the roots only. That didn't have a big effect on the amount of water moving through the system either. Water was still transported, but the leaves were very, very important. Killed the leaves and water transport stopped. Therefore, some mechanism has to involve the leaves for the movement of water in the transport system here. So now, before I get to the mechanism itself, how does water enter through the roots? There's actually 3 different, I put up here 2 pathways, actually there's 3. So change this to 3 pathways. 3 pathways in the soil, how minerals and water can get into the xylem, okay, moving. The plants are designed a little bit different than we are. There is one pathway called the apoplastic pathway, okay, and this is between cells. Now, plants, all their cells are closely packed together, but that doesn't constitute an epithelium. Epithelium is in animals, okay? So I've always mentioned epithelium being close packed cells in animals, but those cells are also bound together by tight junctions or protein junctions that do not allow materials to move between them. These are close packed cells, but material can easily move between cells themselves because they're all together. There's sometimes air spaces between them, not very big air spaces, but they have primary, secondary cell walls made of lignin cellulose fibers, which still have a lot of gaps in them that will allow material, especially small molecules such as ions and water, to move between the cell walls, okay? And then the middle lamella, it's not a big barrier either. So anything can move from the outside soil into the root and head toward the vascular cylinder by going between the cell walls, okay? That's called the apoplastic pathway. Another pathway is through cells, okay? It's called the symplastic pathway. And unlike animals, plants have, for most of their cells throughout the whole body, they have passageways between through the plasma membranes of one cell into the next called plasmodesmata. Now this is sort of analogous to gap junctions in animals, all right? So it's a proteinaceous pore in the plasma membrane that penetrates through the cell wall and into the next cell, so that small molecules can easily move from one cell, from the cytoplasm of one cell to the cytoplasm of another cell without crossing a plasma membrane. Now, this is widespread in plants. In fact, to the point that most of the plant body, all of the cells are connected by plasmodesmata. And so you can perhaps conceive this as just one huge bit of cytoplasm that is divided up into cells, okay? Now, the analogy with gap junctions in animals, gap junctions are only found in animal cells in certain very specialized tissue, okay? We have gap junctions with electrical synapses. We have gap junctions between cardiac cells in the heart, okay? Other than that, you don't have gap junctions almost anywhere else. The plasmodesmata are really widespread. This allows materials to move throughout the plant body, fairly quickly, but also things like viruses that happen to infect one part of the body, they can easily spread through the cytoplasm, through plasmodesmata from one cell to another very rapidly as well. And that's sort of a disadvantage. The only place where this doesn't hold, however, is in the roots. One layer of cells that goes around the vascular cylinder is called the endodermis, which I mentioned before, and these cells secrete a waxy layer. The waxy layer that's in between the cells and up and down is an impermeable barrier for water to be moving and minerals through the apoplastic pathway. It stops that because this is a wax. It's called the Casparian strip, so this is made of wax, and therefore anything that's moving toward the vascular cylinder, toward the xylem, through the apoplastic pathway is halted there. They have to then enter into an endodermal cell, okay? And so that it's really the endodermal root cells that can be selective as to what is entering into the plant and what is not, since it's going through now a transport system dictated by the living forces within the endodermal cell. Okay, all right. So there's yet a third pathway, which is called the transmembrane pathway. All right, so we can still have some types of minerals that will go from cell to cell to cell to cell, but how it differs from the symplastic pathway is that the material has to cross through a plasma membrane. So we have to have transporters of some sort that would transport it into a cell, out of the cell, into the apoplastic pathway, then back into another cell. Okay, so some things actually go this way. But once we get to the endodermis, then everything, no matter how it's entering the root, whether it's by the apoplastic or symplastic pathway, they have to go. Everything is forced to go through an endodermal cell. Okay, this protects the plant to a certain extent because the living cells can exclude certain items that the plant doesn't need. Okay, so once we get to the xylem, how does water move up through the system of dead cells? Well, one thing that's happening at the leaf is evaporation. And this is called in plants transpiration, okay? Because it is an important part of the force that drives water transport in the xylem, is by the evaporation at the top. Okay, so this creates, as water happens to move out of the stomata, okay, the stomata happen to be open, then we get evaporation. that lowers the water tension inside of cells, mesophilic cells, and water will move. Since there's a lower water concentration in those cells, water will move from the xylem into those cells. Okay, so as you're having water moving from the xylem into the cellular tissues, it's creating a gap or creating a low water tension inside of the xylem. And one thing that's very, very important here is cohesion of water molecules. Okay, and I'll get to that here in a moment. Now, with this evaporation at the top of the tree, in a certain sense, it could create a vacuum that, like, how do you get water and soda up a straw? Is that you suck out the air, creating a low pressure region that pulls the water up. Now, that could be a way in which water is moving here in plants, but some of these trees, like redwoods, are well over 300 feet high, okay, 100 meters or so. And if you have a column of water that you create a vacuum in any sort of pipe or tube, then eventually the weight of that water is going to be sufficient enough that gravity pulls it down. And so there's a limit to how far suction can ever bring up water into a tube. And it's only about 10 meters. But we have trees like redwood trees that are much, much taller than 10 meters. And therefore suction is not what is happening here, because that's too limited. For short plants, that could possibly be, but it's not. Can the roots push water up? Because after all, what is happening at the endodermis, okay, at the endodermis, you can have minerals that are actively being pumped into the xylem, okay? And so if you're increasing the solute concentration in the xylem, what's going to happen to water that is outside of the xylem? In the root. We're actively transporting minerals into the xylem, increasing solute concentration. By now, you guys really should get this, because we've talked about this mechanism so many times, is that the water follows the concentration. Once we're in the xylem, there's nowhere else to go as the water comes in but up, okay? It can be pushed up, all right? So there's a little bit of that, but it is very, very, very limited. This is referred to as root pressure. Definitely the root pressure is not sufficient force to bring water all the way to the top of a 100 meter tall tree. But that does happen a little bit. Okay, especially if on a early morning you go out into your garden, you have a very, very small plant, and you find drops of water on the underside of the leaf. Okay, that's usually happened during the night due to root pressure. It's being pushed out. Too much water was pushed up, and it's going out the stomatic. But it isn't very efficient. So actually, there's several different forces. Transpiration is very important at the leaf, but also the cohesion of water molecules to each other plays a very massive role here, okay? And also tension, water tension, okay? And adhesion. Okay, what is the difference between cohesion and adhesion? There's a reason why biology requires you to know chemistry, and there's also a reason why biology requires you to know physics.
Cohesion is water molecules sticking to each other. Adhesion is them sticking to other.
Okay, so cohesion is the molecular or the attraction between like molecules. Water attracts water, okay, due to hydrogen bonding, okay. Adhesion is the attraction of different molecules to each other. In this case, it's also due to hydrogen bonds, okay, polar to polar, okay, polar groups to polar groups. Okay, so all of this, transpiration, cohesion, tension, theory of how water is transported in the xylem is driven by solar energy. Sunlight. Sunlight drives it. Sunlight provides the energy for the movement of water in the plants. Okay, so it's something outside of the plants. How that works, okay, and also cohesion between water molecules, that's really important too. So if we have a big redwood, you know, these things are well over 10 meters tall. Some of them can be as tall as 100 meters, pretty tall. So what is happening now in this figure in your book, if I got that from your, yeah, it is from your textbook. Botanists working with water relationships in plants use a different type of measure. They're measuring something by what is called water pressure, okay? And this is related to differences in solute concentration, but the botanist people like to look at water pressure instead. And so I'm not expecting you to understand these values or where they come from, but they're still related to solute concentration and osmosis. So as we have evaporation up here, water is coming out of the stoma and it's being lost. And as these cells shrink, their water pressure goes up, okay, their demand for water, due to concentration of solutes. Okay, if you remove water, the solutes are going to become more concentrated, and that's going to pull water out of the xylem, okay, to replace it. So as this water comes out, water molecules, they are connected in a long chain by hydrogen bonds all the way down to the roots. They're all connected together. And so as one water molecule exits the xylem due to hydrogen bonding, it creates a tension at the top, but then as this water molecule moves up, it is hydrogen bonded to the next one, which pulls it up, to the next one, which pulls it up, to the next one, which pulls it up, and so forth. And so it's due to the cohesive pull of water going up that can overcome gravity. There is also some adhesion because along the cell walls of the xylem vessels and the tracheids, because there's polar entities here, and we get hydrogen bonding between that and the cell wall. However, this water that's along the side here happens to be relatively hard to move, because when it bonds with adhesion, it is not too mobile. And so it's mostly the water in the middle of the tube that is moving upward by cohesive pull upward. Okay? This is one of the reasons, probably one of the evolutionary forces that allowed the evolution of vessel elements in angiosperms, because tracheids are narrow enough that a lot of this water that is cohesively bound to the sides of the tracheids is not moving, and therefore the diameter there, it's only a little bit in the middle that happens to be drawn upward, okay? Now this water that's adhesively along the sides, you might say creates a little bit of, cuts down the friction flow in the water in the middle. So it's sort of like a lubricant to a certain extent. But with vessels have a wider diameter. Therefore, more water toward the middle can be pumped upward, all right? Okay, and so, in fact, one of the problems if we lose too much water, eventually the pull up here is so strong that this water column gets disrupted because it gets pulled apart. And then we have air molecules in there. Once we get air molecules that separate connections between this column of water, it's now no longer transportable. The water at the top, above that air bubble, will get pulled on up into the leaf, but no new water will move, okay? In other words, that whole column will be destroyed and it is not fixable. It is permanent, okay? And so plants that are experiencing a lot of water stress, if air gets into the xylem and cuts off the continuity of this column of water, then transport ends, all right? So that's very important on how they move, okay? So this is transpiration. Now so evaporation therefore is necessary. It's necessary. Plants have to allow some evaporation, transpiration. If they can't, then in growing parts of the meristem and leaves, flowers, etc., they need minerals, and therefore we have to have that transport of water on up. okay? But it's still a big loss to the plant. So the plant had to evolve compromises that allowed water loss, but also not too much water loss, okay? There had to be some sort of a balance. So yes, they evolved waxy cuticles that cuts down on the water loss, but the bad thing about that is that it also prevents carbon dioxide from entering into the leaf. And therefore, plants evolved openings, usually on the underside of the leaves. Stomata, we've already talked about them. And generally, they're on the underside of the leaves, but in some plants, they can be on the upper epidermis as well. So why the underside? Because this is sort of in the shade, because sunlight is impinging on the top, okay? If we put the stomata on top where solar radiation comes, then the evaporation rate would be much, much higher. So this is sort of protected. And furthermore, if you look at a leaf, the top side of the leaf, relatively nice, smooth, waxy, but you find all these projections, microscopic hairs underside of the leaf. Now, what is the function of those? Those are creating air spaces that hold some of the water there, keep it humid, so that there's less water loss out of the stomata, okay? So there's actually functional reasons why plants evolved the way they did. The guard cells, of course, can open and close, depending on the stress within the plant. If it's losing too much water, and therefore they will close. However, once they close, then they're not getting carbon dioxide coming in, and that is a problem. However, most of these leaves have gas spaces in the lower spongy mesophyll, so that even with the guard cells closed, they still have a reserve of carbon dioxide. But as photosynthesis continues, then in those gas spaces, carbon dioxide concentrations go down, oxygen goes up. And in C3 plants, that creates a big problem, because then photosynthesis starts using oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. In the Calvin cycle, something called photorespiration, and it's a wasteful process. So transpiration in plants, there's some benefits. That is the only way through a dead system that you can move minerals into the growing areas where they're needed. And therefore, it's driven by solar energy. Furthermore, this creates evaporative cooling, because sunlight is shining on all these leaves, and solar radiation is a very heavy heat load. But by evaporative cooling, you go into a forest on a hot day, you can feel it, okay? It's due to lower temperatures, not necessarily because of the shade. The shade does protect against solar radiation, and hence the feeling to the body is less in terms of heat. All objects will get heat temperatures by 3 different mechanisms. Okay, one is by conduction and convection. Those are 2 different mechanisms. You'll learn about them in, of course, physics primarily. I'm not going to talk about them here. But another one that is very, very important that most people don't realize about is radiation, okay? Every object that's above 0 degrees Kelvin emits electromagnetism. You are given off electromagnetism, and it's in long wave. You can't see it, we can't detect it. We do detect shorter wave electromagnetism as light. Shorter, we can't see it either, we can't detect it either. But all objects are giving off many different wavelengths of electromagnetism, and the heat load goes from a hotter object to a cooler object. And it's instantaneous cross space, okay? So when you're outside, you know, the solar radiation is being absorbed by rocks, concrete, and it is re-radiating that at a longer wavelength that you cannot see, but it carries heat to your body, okay? And it is the main source of heat load in animals, okay? It's mostly radiation. But here in the forest, you're protected from the radiation, And also the temperature of the trees due to evaporative cooling is that their temperature is lower, and therefore instead of heat moving from the tree to you, it's the other way around, okay, due to radiation. All right? Okay, so this transpiration is a compromise between photosynthesis and transport. Okay, have to do both. For photosynthesis, stomata need to be open, have to have them open. However, and also for transpiration, the stomata need to be open as well. However, if you're losing too much water, then it could be too dangerous for the plant, and therefore need to have a mechanism to be able to shut that down. Yes?
How does radiation cause evaporative cooling and
No. The point is with radiation, it's always moving from a warmer body to a cooler body. Everything's giving off radiation, but a body that has the surface is higher temperature, then there's more radiation moving this way than that way. I mean, the radiation is going both ways, but it accumulates in the cooler object, okay? So if you're in a forest with this evaporative cooling, then the surfaces of the leaves, their surface temperature is low. And if you're an animal that's maintaining a constant body temperature, your surface temperature is higher than that of the leaf, and therefore your heat load, you're losing heat through radiation to the trees. Whereas if you're out here in the sunlight, and you're not in, even if you're in the shade, but it's, you're still exposed to asphalt, buildings, even the grass, okay? If their surface temperature is greater than your surface temperature, then the majority of the distance, the more radiation is coming into your body than going away. Okay?
So is radiation like a temperature gradient? Because you're going from something that's like high
Is it what?
Is it like a temperature type gradient? Because you're going from a high temp to
Okay, the relationship here is the shortest wavelength. Okay, the radiation is being radiated at all sorts of wavelengths. Okay, but the shortest wavelength is that is being projected here is related to the surface temperature. Okay, the hotter the surface, the shorter the wavelength. That's why we see light. That's why the sun, we can see it, because the surface is damn hot, okay? And it's putting out, and if you have a fire, okay, you can see the light because the temperature is high enough that it's re-radiating in part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. Okay, and in fact, as the fire goes down, the coals, you still see red light. Okay, red is about the longest wavelength that our eyes can detect, because it's still cooler, but it's still hot enough that it's putting out radiation that we can detect by our eyes. Okay, so it's the radiation is related to, what wavelengths are related to surface temperature. And even if it's a cool surface, like a stone at night, it's still putting out radiation, but it's very long wave. Okay, so the wavelength varies with the surface temperature. Okay, all right, so we need to prevent too much water loss, all right? And so there has to be a compromise, and this is controlled pretty much by guard cells. So stomata consists of a pore plus the guard cells, and there's two guard cells, one on each side. And these guard cells can change shape due to certain cues, and by changing their shape, they can either close the pore or open the pore. Okay, so if they take in a bunch of water, they become turgid. Okay, the cell walls of guard cells are so laid down in such a way that as the cell fills with water, and all this water goes into the central vacuole, incidentally. Okay, that's real important there. And as the central vacuole increases in size, it pushes against the rest of the cytoplasm, against the cell walls, and these will bubble out as C-shaped. Okay, it will be C-shaped, and therefore that pore is open, stomata is open. If they need to close, then it is due to an exit of water. Water leaves the guard cells, and the central vacuole becomes smaller. There's less pressure against the cell walls, and they sort of collapse, so that This is said to be flaccid, and that closes the pore, okay? So this is stomata open, this is the pore, this is one guard cell, this is another guard cell, and then these would be epidermal cells on each side here. This is where it is flaccid, the water has left it, and it has collapsed, whereas on the other side, they're filled with water. They have chloroplasts too, okay? So they are photosynthetic, just like some epidermal cells are as well. But what controls this, okay, is, once again, it is not magic, all right? So there's no pumps at the cellular level to move water. So the water is being moved by manipulating solutes. And so how this system works in a guard cell, the major player is a hydrogen ATPase, hydrogen ion ATPase. Requires ATP energy to do it, but it is pumping hydrogen ions out, okay? And that's a positive charge. And so if we're pumping a positive charge out, what's that going to do to membrane potential? The distribution of ions or charge across the plasma membrane there, just like in animals, positive on the outside, negative on the inside. That's all through all of life. So if you're pumping hydrogen ions out, we're adding positive charge to the outside. What's it doing to the membrane potential? What is it? Okay, it's making it more negative, hyperpolarizing. So yeah, we hyperpolarize it. And there are other players here, voltage-gated channels, that instead of responding to a depolarization as we did in neurons, they respond to a hyperpolarization. They open or come into play when the voltage membrane hyperpolarizes. Okay, that's where their threshold happens to be. And these are potassium channels. Okay, so if we open up these voltage-gated potassium channels, and there's several different types of potassium channels, potassium is still higher concentration on the inside. Okay, it's still higher on the inside. But we have moved positive ions out, and that drives these in. Okay, so it's negative on the inside, and so these don't come, the potassium does not come into concentration equilibrium. It's electrochemical equilibrium. But nonetheless, the point is, we're driving potassium in. This is something that's happening. And there's also a co-transporter. The hydrogen ions come back in. And in doing so, they're going through a chlorine hydrogen ion co-transporter, which then is bringing chlorine and hydrogen ion back in, right? Another thing that's happening is that starch is broken down. Starch, of course, is a polymer of glucose. But one big, huge starch molecule has the osmotic effect of one glucose molecule, because it's a matter of particles, the number of particles. Okay, so this is broken down, and of course, what is the breakdown product of the glycogen? First level? Glucose. But from glucose into cellular respiration, they can produce malate, okay, malic acid, okay? So my point being here is that malic acid is derived from the glucose, all right? So there's big stores of starch here. That is then being broken down into malate. And so what do we have here is that we're increasing solute concentration inside the cell. Okay, it's driven by that hydrogen ion ATPase, but still we have ended up driving in potassium, chlorine, hydrogen ions. We increase the solute concentration here by malate. What direction will water move? In. It moves in. Okay, so these plasma membranes have aquaporins too. Okay, aquaporins are present in plants as well as in animals. Right? Now, some water can go across plasma membranes, even if they don't have aquaporins. Because even though it's a polar molecule, it's small enough, and whether it can go through a plasma membrane really depends on the lipid composition of phospholipids. You can make the membrane very impermeable, okay? For example, the ascending loop of Henle, that membrane is very impermeable. But we can also speed up the rate at which water can go across by adding aquaporins. Okay, so this does have aquaporins. So we're increasing solute concentration here, and as a consequence, water moves in from the surrounding areas. These become turgid, and hence that opens the stomata. That's the mechanism by which stomata happen to be open. Okay? And of course, this malate is malic acid. Malate is malate, malic acid, they go together. Okay, they're just the way organic acids work. Okay, so higher solute concentration. So here, the water concentration is being manipulated by actively manipulating the solute concentration. All right, now to go just the opposite direction, to close the stomata, that ATP-driven pump is inhibited. Okay, it's shut off, so that we're not pumping anything out, but we still have, these solutes inside that we have to get rid of. And so there are passive chlorine channels. This is not the same as the hydrogen ion chlorine channel. It's a different protein, but it's a passive channel that just, once we've turned off that motor, chlorine concentration is always higher on the outside. Okay, so just, that's the way it is. It's on higher on the outside. Now, when we had the ATP-driven pump working, we could use the hydrogen ion to co-transport chlorine back into the cell. But now we don't have that energy source anymore. We've turned off the hydrogen ion gradient, and therefore the chlorine can exit down its own concentration gradient. And there's also channels for malate. Now, usually you don't like losing organic material, but nonetheless, it's malate small, it can come out here, and it can be taken up by adjacent cells, so it's not lost to the system. But nonetheless, and furthermore, inside of the cytoplasm, the malate will be reconverted back into starch, which lessens its osmotic effect. Because we have thousands of malate molecules, and if we convert them back into one starch molecule, then we have 1,000 solute particles versus one, okay? So we're lowering the solute concentration here. And as a consequence of lowering the solute concentration here, we're actually increasing the solute concentration in the interstitial fluids. That water will then exit, and the stomata closes. So these are the physiological mechanisms by which they're working, all right? Okay, now, still, there has to be some sort of stimulation that drives all this. And here, I'm not going to go like I did in animals. A lot of times I went into some really detail as to what the absolute stimulus for a particular action happened to be. Here I'm going to be somewhat general, is that for one thing, light stimulates the opening of the stomata. So exactly how light does that, I'm not going to go into the details. All right, just only know that is a stimulus. So generally during the night, stomata close, and then in the early morning they open. Okay, and it's usually very much associated with blue light. Blue light is a very strong stimulus for opening the stomata. Another stimulus would be low concentration of carbon dioxide in the mesophyll. Okay, that stimulates the opening of the stomata. And so this here is not related to light. It's related to the carbon dioxide concentration. So if there's a lot of water stress and the stomata had to be closed, and this here goes down because of photosynthesis, then it's a pressure that stimulates, but doesn't necessarily guarantee that the stomata will open, because really what happens here is the input of all sorts of signals that have to be worked out. But these tend to open it, close, stimulus is water loss, okay? Turgid pressure in the mesophyll cells can affect the water pressure inside of the guard cells as well, and therefore that encourages them to close. And high carbon dioxide concentration actually leads to stomatoclosing. So a lot of scientists had postulated that our food supplies would get better as carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, simply with our burning of fossil fuels, simply because more concentrated carbon dioxide for photosynthesis should improve it, but actually it might do just the opposite, okay? So having too high of carbon dioxide would lead to the stomatic closing, which is cutting down the amount of carbon dioxide that would be going into the plant for photosynthesis. So things are not as simple as some people like to put it. Also high temperature. This will also lead to the closing of the stomatic, simply because high temperature must mean greater transpiration, more water loss, all right? Now, some of this is driven by, especially the close, it's driven by the release of stress cells of another hormone, abscisic acid, okay? This is a plant hormone. We've talked about auxin, but this here is now another one. It's released by these, and it is one of the triggers for affecting that hydrogen ion ATPase, okay, primarily. Okay, so guard cells, how they open and close, try to control some of the water loss in the zyme. Now, transport in the phloem, it's a little bit different because these are alive, okay? So symptom cells, companion cells are living, and they have to be, because here the flow, this is in phloem, it's sap. The sticky stuff that you find whenever you wound a tree is mostly phloem sap. Aphids. Does everyone know what an aphid is? Okay, it's a tiny insect which happens to be the fleas for plants. Okay, so they can get on the leaves. They have a proboscis, needle-like proboscis. They drill into the phloem in the leaf, and there's enough pressure here that just squirts right into the aphid, and it's full of sugars and amino acids, but a lot of water. And so they have out their rear end these two pipe-like projections connected to their system, their digestive system that releases excess fluid that's flowing through the body of the aphid, and it drips down on your car. So if you've been parked under a tree and you come out there and find all this sticky stuff, have you ever had that experience? Surely you have. Okay, well that's because you have the tree infested with aphids, and that's mostly phloem sap that's coming down there. Okay, but it's coming out of the tree due to the presence of thousands of aphids up there. All right, and so if you want to protect your car from the tree, your favorite tree that you park under, that it always makes it sticky, is you need to somehow kill all the aphids. Then it wouldn't happen. Okay, all right, so this has that material. Now, the flow here is by bulk flow, all right? So what is bulk flow? I've used that term before. The material that exits capillaries in animals, it exits by bulk flow. Is that selective? No, okay, except for maybe for size. Okay, so bulk flow is due to the movement of a fluid system due to different pressures. Okay, not just only in our circulatory system. Of course, the two pressures we're talking about is hydrostatic pressure, blood pressure. Okay, blood pressure, and its opposite pressure, osmotic pressure. So it's a difference between those two. And so this bulk flow is similar, okay? It is due to, in this case, it's created by living cells, as I'll get to here. Now the movement of the sap is always from source, that's where it's produced or stored. where the material has been produced by photosynthesis or stored. Okay, so there's storage depots throughout the body to a sink. A sink is any organ, tissue, cells that happen to be needing that material. Okay, and so the leaf, during the growing season, the leaf is the major source. And fruits, flowers, new leaves, okay, apical meristems, they would be excellent sinks, okay, because this is where the material has to go. But also to the root, because root, not just only in winter, but all throughout the year, root cells that are alive cannot photosynthesize. And they're totally dependent on material from the leaf, okay? But it's also a place where a lot of excess nutrients happen to be stored, starch and other things. And then in spring, when a new shoot just comes up, it takes some time for its leaves to come out and become photosynthetic so it can support itself. And so during that time, growth period, it has to have some input, okay? So if this is a perennial plant, then it's stored reserves in the root, and therefore the flow in the phloem would be from root to shoot, just the other way around. Now I use the word perennial, okay? Plants, especially herbaceous plants, they can be annual. That means the whole lifespan is 1 year. Okay, the plant grows, dies, reproduces, dies, and you never see it again. Perennials are ones that live multiple years. Biennials are plants that live 2 years. Usually with perennials, a lot of times the first year they just grow a little bit and you don't see any flowers or anything, and they will bloom in the second, third, and fourth years afterwards. Okay, woody plants are all perennials, but nonetheless, those would be storing food reserves in the roots for the following year for the growth after they've lost their leaves or above ground things. All right, so what happens in the phloem is that it goes from source to sink. So at the source, where there's a lot of sucrose being produced from photosynthesis, is that once again we have phloem loading. Okay, there's a hydrogen ion, ATPase. Now remember that the mesophyll cells, companion cells, and the sieve tube cells, well, mostly not the they're connected by plasmodesmata, but nonetheless, actually there's not plasmodesmata between the companion cell and the mesophyll cell. They don't have plasmodesmata, but everything else here it does. So as we produce this sugar, this is where the hydrogen ATPase is. So we're pumping hydrogen ions out of the cell, out of the cell. And there's a co-transporter. I don't know if Dr. Barnaby talked about this in 1A, but I do it. So here we have the cell, plant cell. We have ATP energy that pumps hydrogen out. So we're creating a hydrogen ion gradient. And in the membrane, there is hydrogen ion sucrose co-transporter. So the energy source, of course, is the hydrogen ion gradient. And so this wants to go back into the cell. And so it comes in, but it can only do so if it carries sucrose along with it. Okay, so the sucrose is being co-transported into the companion cell, and the companion cell is connected to the sieve tube cell. Okay, so this is moving sucrose from where it's being reproduced into ultimately the sieve tube cell. So as we're increasing solute concentration here, what direction will water go? It'll go in. Now remember that in plants with the vascular bundles, xylem and phloem are always right next to each other. Okay, so a lot of the source of the water will be from xylem, going laterally into the phloem. As we've increased by pumping in here sucrose, still required ATP energy to create a hydrogen ion gradient. The hydrogen ion gradient is used to co-transport sucrose into here. Water moves in and it increases the pressure right there. And so the material is by bulk flow forced to go away from that area. Okay, just by water pressure. Water moving in, it has to go somewhere. Because these things have cell walls. They can't expand. Okay, they can't swell. And so this is pushed in, down, either up or down in the zip tube cell. But it goes in the direction of a sink. Because somewhere at a sink, we're taking sucrose out where it's being consumed. It's either, if it's in the root, that might be stored there, or if it's in a leaf that's growing, okay, a meristem or flower, the sugar is being broken down to glucose, fructose, used in cellular respiration, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, near in the phloem, close to the sink, the concentration, particle concentration is low. It's high here, and therefore things move in that direction, okay? And then what happens with the water? The water goes back into the xylem and gets carried back up, okay? So this is the movement in loading and unloading in the phloem. It still requires live cells for the sodium, sucrose, or not sodium, the hydrogen pump has to be alive, okay? All right, so that's basically, I just put this up here as a summary. That's all I'm going to cover on plants, okay, the movement throughout the system. Okay, any questions?
When you were talking about the perennial and biennial plants, I was wondering, what causes the lifespan of some plants to decrease?
Okay, that's all genetic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and genetic over a long evolutionary history, okay? Because a lot of the annuals, okay, their evolution is selected for success, okay? So a lot of the annual plants are, what can I say, not invasive, that's not the word, but they usually favor disturbed habitats, okay? So like there's a flood that denudes the area, or a glacier has moved back, or some person has come along with a plow and destroyed all the surface. Because their strategy is to have very small seeds, to grow real fast, produce a lot of seeds, but not live very long, okay? Because usually that habitat that has been disturbed, eventually other types of plants will move in that are more stable, and eventually it won't be disturbed anymore. And they can't compete with stable plants. And so there's several different types of strategies that living organisms have evolved that are successful, you know, because the whole name of the game is to produce enough offspring to survive. And so this strategy of very quick reproduction, very small seeds, very little resources given to each seed, and living in the habitat that won't last very long is successful. Okay, but if everything was stable, that you only had stable habitats that were never disturbed, then those would be selected against. The only reason they survive is because disruptions are happening all the time, fires and so forth, okay? All right, that sort of answered the question, but really, the answer to that question is a whole new lecture, okay? Which I'll do if you want me to. No. I didn't think so. That's enough, yes.
This is like kind of an unrelated question, but a lot of the pictures in this slide were not like, in the PowerPoint slide that you had.
Ah, really? These aren't there? Okay, I will be like this.
Yeah, like I was on there.
Okay, all right, so I will go through and look at both of them, and I will supply those. Okay, I'll supply these. Okay, but you have this text, don't you?
Yeah, for this slide we do, but then the slide that's right after that,
This one?
or,
There was some slides where the text was like not there.
yeah.
I think
Okay,
that's just-
I will go through them, because usually what happens, this is a lecture that probably this is the first time I've been able to give it for probably about 5 years. And so in the meantime, I'm always preparing for it. And so I keep changing this without changing the student notes, because I say, I'll fix that if I get to it. But after 5 years, I said, I've completely forgotten about that. I haven't had it for about 5 years. I usually throw this one out because I ran out of time, okay? Which looks like I have a luxury of time now. We're done with the plans. So the only thing we have left is, if no one has any more questions here, I'm gonna go into ecology, and since I'm starting, I didn't expect to start this until next week, Tuesday. So it means that I'm not gonna add any more. So it looks like Thursday, it will be if I have anything to lecture on, it's gonna be very, very short. I probably have a little bit, but not much. So the rest of Thursday will be just question and answer, okay? Sort of preparing for the final, whatever, okay? Because I'm pretty sure I'm going to stop very soon, yes.
Earlier you were talking about that phenomenon with like, in terms of the tree, like pulling force, when it's too strong, it like kind of messes with it, right?
What's that?
You were talking earlier about that like pulling force phenomenon?
Yes.
Where it like disrupts it. Let's say it happens in the midline of a tree. The upper portion, the like leaves will probably eventually like die off, and you'll just have branches. And what happens to the midline? Does it just
Okay,
still remain in the tree?
this will continue. If we lose a leaf and initiate in the bud, axillary bud, a branch, it still maintains connections to the xylem. Okay, we'll have new xylem grow there.
Oh, it will just.
Yeah. So, and it grows in such a way that the water column isn't broken. Okay, because if we break that water column sufficiently, big bubble within a trachea or a vessel is that particular column is dead. Okay, it'll never be able to do it. But still, there's mechanisms up here where the embryonic cells are maintaining connections with creating new xylem, so that the water column remains. Yeah, it's not lost.
Oh.
Okay. Okay. All right. Then ecology. And once again, this is going to be just not going to be able to cover all of the chapters. So there's very special types of ecology. There are many different branches, but I'm only going to be at a very broad scale. Yes.
I don't think this lecture slide is posted on campus.
It is.
Oh, it is.
So if you go to,
Oh, I see it.
okay, it should be there, yeah. Okay, because I noticed that, yesterday, oh my, I think I'll get into this on Thursday, so I put it up real quickly last night. So, yeah, and this is a lecture I always give, okay, so it's never been left out. So your slides should be complete. Okay, so all we can do here is just give you a overview of the broadest area of biology, ecology. So we started in 101A. You started, the whole strategy we have is to start you at cells and biomolecules, the small things. And then we've moved to tissues, we moved to organs, and now here, organ systems. But the big picture is ecology. It's putting everything together. Now, this is what ecology is. It's a study of the interrelationships, reactions between organisms at various combinations and their environment. And this environment, I'm saying, is very, very broad in definition, because the environment can involve the physical environment, the sunlight, the amount of rainfall, temperatures, etc. But it can also be the biological environment, the things they eat, the things that eat them, and parasites, and even competition between individuals of the same species. These are all part of the environment. And this environment is made up of both living and non-living components. Okay, biotic, I use that word, it's the living components of an environment. The other organisms, the other species, etc. But the abiotic components are very important too. Nature of the soil, whether it's sand or clay, and even the mineral components that happen to be in the soil, that's very important for plants, it can make a big difference. Other things such as the weather, temperature, seasonality, these are all abiotic components, all right? So a lot of times these two words are used interchangeably in the newspapers, just like a lot of journalists will call spiders insects, which irritates the hell out of me. They're not. This here, ecology and environmentalism, it's not the same thing. Ecology still informs environmental decisions. Now at the universities, they will have a department called environmental science, okay? And if you go into a field like environmental science, it's legitimate, you know, it's not radical. They're not out there with their ships, you know, sinking fishing vessels or something like that. But nonetheless, what you'll find is in your curriculum, you'll have some biology, but you'll mostly be studying law. Okay, that's a big thing with them. Ecology is pure science. Okay, it's a biological science. It has no value judgments. It doesn't decide what is good and what is bad. It nonetheless will inform environmental programs and politicians for them to make decisions, but doesn't have any values. We have values as humans, but this is still science, okay? And it's based on what does scientific data tell us how things relate with each other and how they respond. Okay, so usually these environmental studies are informed by the science of ecology. But as I said, those programs at universities, probably well over half your curriculum will be mostly about studying human behavior, human economies, and environmental law, okay? So study areas. So I'm not going to go into all the different study areas of ecology, but still you can walk out of the class having some general idea as to what ecology covers. There is something called organismal ecology, and so this is looking at the behavior and morphology and adaptations that animals and plants have as individuals against environmental challenges. So such things as, why do we find this species here but not there? Okay, why is it in this locale and not there? Why do we have polar bears in northern Canada but not in southern Argentina? Okay, things like that, distribution. Also, it looks at tolerances to abiotic factors. Okay, so why do we find redwoods near the coast and not further inland? Because a lot of that has a lot to do with abiotic factors. Another branch besides organismal ecology is population ecology. And usually this one here has a lot of math to it, okay? A lot of mathematical equations that have been produced by scientists that are in this particular area. So they're wanting to see the interactions between populations and their environment. Why does the population fluctuate? Okay, why does it go up, go down? Especially between predators and their prey. Usually they cycle quite a bit through many, many years. As predator population goes up, or excuse me, as the prey population goes up, predator population sort of follows, and then this goes down, and there's a tailing by the predator population. So what affects their size, so forth. Then climbing the ecology tree, we then come to community ecology. And so a community is an ecological community. So if we take this now hierarchy that we started with in biology 101A, you know, but the structure of life is built in layers, okay, hierarchical. So we went from molecules to biological molecules to organelles to cells, cells to tissues, tissues to organs, organs to organ systems, species. Now we can still go on up. Populations, species, and communities. It's a part of it. So a community is any local area, okay, it's usually local. It consists of all the organisms in that area. All the trees, all the grass, all the bugs, all the aphids, everything that's alive. That is a community. All right, and so with community ecology, a lot of times they're studying the actions between different species, so predation, predator-prey relationships are a big deal here. Competition, even if the two species are not eating each other, they still may compete for the same or similar living space, resources, and so forth. And how does that work out? How does diseases, parasites, relate to the interactions of these populations? And then the big picture is ecosystem ecology. Okay, the interrelationship between the living community and its abiotic surroundings. So a community consists of only living things. The ecosystem, however, is all the community plus their abiotic surroundings and the interrelationships that happen there. Okay, and this is primarily where my lecture will be, okay, at this level. Okay, looking at large pictures of ecosystems and biomes. And so here with ecosystem ecology, they're concerned with the flow of energy. Okay, energy enters life always through the production of organic molecules by photosynthetic organisms. Okay, everything enters there, and then it gets passed. So every organic molecule in your body started out in a plant.
Just to make sure both the community and ecosystem are just kinds of small areas.
Yeah, so an ecosystem is still a restricted area, defined, and also a community is defined. So you could talk about the ecological community of Mount Diablo, okay, something like that, all right? Or the ecological community of the Bay Area, of the Bay, okay?
So is, like, would you say Mount Diablo is an ecosystem?
Well, you know, there's no strict boundaries between these communities, but you have to sort of define them. Okay, is that what your question was?
Yeah, but I just thought we previously had those ecosystems like desert, tundra.
Okay, those are biomes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's something else. Okay, so energy flow. How does this energy, how much of it comes from the sun that gets captured by plants? And how much of not all that energy that's captured by plants gets passed up the food chain, because plants are alive. Okay, they have metabolism. They have to use some of that energy that they captured for their own growth, their own reproduction, and their own metabolism. Therefore, there's only a limited amount of that gets passed to the next level, and only a limited amount of that gets passed to the next level, as I'll get to a little bit later on. So that's talking about the energy flow, chemical cycling, okay? So carbon cycles through living systems and non-living systems. But we also have not only a carbon cycle, but there's a water cycle that involves both living organisms and the environment. Phosphorus cycles, and some of these cycles can cycle over millions of years, okay? The carbon cycle's much faster, okay? But phosphorus is a very big long-term cycle, all right? And so forth. So, as I said, our hierarchy populations, which is all the members of a particular species in a local area. Okay, so all the poppies, California poppies on just above the pond, if there are, that would be a population. And several different populations of different organisms still in the same area constitutes an ecological community. And then if we add to the community the abiotic factors, then we have an ecosystem. Then if we join together many different ecosystems that may not be exactly the same, but still they're influence each other over a very broad area of the Earth's surface, then we have a biome. And then if we join together all the biomes, so these biomes are the major collection of ecosystems that usually are based on the physiognomy of plants. What type of plant body shapes happen to be there? For example, desert biome. Desert biome, most of the plants usually have thick stems, ways to save waters, very small leaves to prevent evaporation, and they have that general form. Whereas grasslands, that's another biome. Once again, the major plants are grasses, all right? Not that there's no trees there. So a tree along a river is a riparian ecosystem, and it is joined with a grassland ecosystem to form a larger biome. Okay, so the biomes are very, very large. And if we put all the biomes on Earth together, which is a more limited number, we have more different ecosystems than we have biomes. Okay, so as we're going down here, we are decreasing the number of units that happen to be there. Okay, by the time we get to the biomes, there's restricted number of biomes across the Earth. And then all the biomes on Earth is the biosphere. The biosphere is defined as all parts of the Earth where you have life. Okay, so that can be pretty high in the atmosphere. That can be also very deep underground, because we're starting to find bacterial life really deep in the Earth. Okay, still part of the biosphere. All right. Now, I'm mostly going to concentrate on patterns, abiotic patterns that control where biomes are found. Okay, if you look at a biome map of the world, it isn't accidental where deserts are found. It isn't accidental where you have grasslands, and it isn't accidental where you have temperate forests. Okay, these are all biomes. They're all influenced by abiotic factors. Abiotic factors that are not evenly distributed across the Earth's surface, and they influence where these biomes happen to be located. So some important abiotic factors, of course, temperature. Okay, that's not the same from equator to poles. You go up to northern Alaska, it's usually pretty cold, especially during the winter. And usually around the equator, the temperature is warm. Furthermore, seasonality is a big deal here with temperature. So it's not just temperature alone, it's also seasonality. That changes. The closer at the equator, there's hardly no seasons whatsoever. It's the same temperature from all the year round. Whereas in temperate regions further to the north, to the south, you have cold winters, hot summers, and some things in between. And water availability, precipitation, and in what form, okay? And here it isn't just water, no, here I said water availability. It's not necessarily always the amount of precipitation, okay? For example, around Austin, Texas, and Seattle, Washington, they have about the same amount of precipitation per year. But if you look at the types of plants growing around Austin, Texas, they're almost desert-like, okay? They're that type, whereas around Seattle, Washington, they're forest, okay? So it isn't just, what counts for that? Evaporation. Evaporation is much, much higher in around Texas than it is up in further north. And so water availability is a very important thing. Sunlight, I need sunlight for photosynthesis. And the sunlight is not equally distributed across the face of the earth, nor from season to season. Sunlight here in California, you have the highest amount of sunlight impinging on us on June 21st. And after that, it drops, okay? The lowest amount of light is December 21st, okay? And so we don't have the same amount of light all the way around. For plants in a forest, they compete for light, okay? This is probably what led to the evolution of trees, because the taller you are, you get more light, okay? And the things underneath, they're outcompeted, but they have evolved ways to survive on less light, okay? So this is, and even in the aquatic environment where we have photosynthetic algae. Light is also stratified. You get most of the light at the top, but as it goes down, the water and living organisms absorb much of the light, and eventually you reach a depth where there is no light. It's dark down there, okay? And that is an abiotic factor. Photoperiod, okay? Here's the length of the day. Okay, for a plant, the longest photoperiod they have, the longest within 24 hours. So we're talking about within 24 hours. How much of it is daylight, how much of it is night? That's the photoperiod. So our largest photoperiod, longest photoperiod, is June 21st. And the shortest photoperiod is December 21st. That's our shortest day of light. Okay, and in between those two dates, the light, the amount of light fluctuates. Okay. Wind. Wind is a big abiotic factor because if it's a hot day, it's a stress on plants, right? Because they're transpiring way too much. But it even becomes even worse if we have a wind blowing, because then we have convection moving water away from the surface of the leaf and making it drier, so that the loss of water at the leaf becomes even greater. Okay, so that is a factor for plants. Soil, okay, because there's variation in the soils. Not only from, the soil comes from the bedrock, okay? Soils evolved from the rock that was there, and from one place on earth to the next, we don't have the same types of rocks. Some places they have limestone, which was formed deep in the ocean, and they only have certain types of mineral components there compared to granitic types of, or basaltic types of soils that they've evolved over years, but nutrient content for the plant differs. Texture, that can affect the ability to get water. Because if it's real sandy, sand is good at holding water to a certain extent, but it also, water can move through it real fast, okay? If it's clay, okay, the particles of clay real close together, it's almost like cement. It holds, doesn't allow water to penetrate, and most of the water is lost on the surface as it runs away. So something in between is best for holding water into the plant. And disturbances, very major and important abiotic factor. We can't avoid it, and here in California, fires is one of those things that has become worse over the years, but fires and things like this, they produce both, they're both destructive, but they also produce opportunities for certain new organisms to move in. Okay, and that's where I think I'm going to stop. I still have other abiotic factors, but it's mostly my take-home message here is that these abiotic factors are very important in determining where on the face of the earth we find deserts, where we find forest, grasslands, and so forth. And I'll get into that on Tuesday. Okay. That's where we stop. This is also going to be the stopping point for the quiz. So the quiz will cover all plants. Okay, those two lectures, both of them were real short. I was able to complete them, okay, which is unheard of. And then up to here. Okay, I thought I saw a hand.
Did you pass out a sign-in sheet?
No, I decided that people skipped today I wouldn't know about. I didn't want to know. But I said that there's enough bodies in here, I'm not unhappy. Okay. Okay, that's it. And the reason I did that is I only have, after this, 2 more lectures, and I'd have to print out a new sheet. And printing out a new sheet for just, I decided,